Welcome to Basic Brewing Radio for Thursday, January 26th, 2006. I'm James Spencer. Here at Basic Brewing Radio, we're all about home brewing, making beer at home. Well, this week, we make bad-tasting beer on purpose. A group of my fellow brewers recently joined me to try out the FlavorActiv Enthusiast beer taste troubleshooting kit. We'll listen to the first half of our bad-tasting adventure in just a couple of minutes. First, let's go to the mailbag, though. George in Erie, Colorado, has a seasonal question. George says, as I get ready to brew my first batch, I have a concern about keeping my glass carboy fermenter warm enough. We let the house get pretty cool here in the evenings. 53 degrees is what we turn the thermostat down to. So I have a concern that the fermenting brew would be too cold. My first thought was that I would take care of this with an electric blanket, but a few Google searches show me that the preferred methods are either a pad under the carboy or a belt around the carboy. Belts seem a bit cheaper than pads, about half, actually, George says. Anyway, I bet you can imagine my questions regarding this. Which is better? So, George, I don't know. Here in Arkansas, I've never really had a problem in keeping my beer warm, so I'll open it up to the listeners. Do you out there have advice for George? What's your experience with belts or pads in keeping fermenters warm? I guess George could do lagers in the wintertime, but if he wants to do an ale and needs to keep his beer warm while it's fermenting, what should he do? We can glean some information from a couple of past emails for hints on what others have used to solve the same problem. Ben from Estacada, Oregon, wrote recently and said, I've read from various sources that temperature control is one of the most important things that you can do to improve your homebrew. I recently ordered a carboy heater. It's a sheath that you wrap around your carboy and plug in, kind of like a waterbed heater. Because Ben says it's actually too cold here in Oregon right now to brew ales. And he said at that point he was still waiting for the carboy heater to arrive. So we don't know how it worked out, but Ben went on to suggest a show on temperature control. So there is more interest there in doing a show on keeping beer cold and warm while it's fermenting. Jay from Salem, Oregon, writes with an innovative solution that he's found. Jay says there are many discussions about dealing with fermentation and storage temperature, and I've not heard anyone who suggested my solution. Jay says he got an old refrigerator free from his in-laws, lucky guy, and got a thermostat from my homebrew shop. It basically goes between the refrigerator and the plug and turns it off and on depending on where I set the gauge. If I'm doing an ale and need a warmer temperature than ambient temperatures, I put a 15-watt light bulb in the fridge and put a tinfoil cover over it. With this, I can get any temperature that I want. I also use this fridge for storing my beers that I'm aging when it's not in use for the brewing process. So, there's another solution. Jay in Salem, Oregon, is using a light bulb in his refrigerator to get the warmer temperatures. So I'm going to ask those who are in colder areas, what do you do? What do you use to keep your fermenters warm during the wintertime? You can send your solutions to james@basicbrewing.com or use the contact form on basicbrewing.com. And please, don't forget to tell us where you're from. One more quick email because we've got a long show this week. Matt from State College, Pennsylvania wrote to get advice on making a vanilla stout. He wanted to know whether to use vanilla extract or vanilla beans and when to add the flavoring. Well, I remembered tasting a vanilla porter from Dry Dock Brewing Company in Aurora, Colorado, when I was at the Great American Beer Festival. That porter was excellent. So I wrote Kevin DeLang, the brewer at Dry Dock, for some advice. And Kevin says, I tell homebrewers to use whole vanilla beans. You can use about 4 or 5 for 5 gallons. Kevin says to split down the center and then chop them up and soak them in just enough rum to cover them. Soak them in the rum during primary and then add the chopped up beans and rum to the secondary. And he says it turns out nice. So very good if Kevin says that's the way to do it, then I'm sure that's a good way to do it. Kevin is also the owner of the Brew Hut, a homebrew shop in Aurora, Colorado. And you can find out more about his shop at thebrewhut.com. And we thank Kevin for his help. This week is a milestone of sorts. This week marks the first time that I've produced a Basic Brewing video podcast that is completely different from the audio version. In this week's video podcast, I rack the six-pack IPA into the secondary fermenter and add whole hops for dry hopping. You can go to basicbrewingradio.com to view the video, or you can subscribe to the video podcast through iTunes or any other podcast aggregator. And we're working on a page to be a home to the video podcast on the site, so we can archive past episodes there. Now, before we go on, I want to thank everyone who's sending in feedback on the all-grain DVD. From what I've read, it looks like we did a pretty good job overall, and I appreciate the suggestions for how we can tweak the video to make it a little more clear. You still have time to get in on the pre-release version of our DVD for the low price of $10 by going to basicbrewing.com/grain. That's basicbrewing.com/grain. Well, now on to the meat of the subject. 3 fellow brewers and I got together recently to taste some bad beer. We tried out a kit that consists of powders that you add to beer to simulate off flavors from the brewing process. It was sometimes nasty, to tell you the truth, but very educational. Okay, usually as brewers, we get together to taste good beer, or what we hope to be good beer. But tonight we are here for the purpose of tasting bad flavors in beer. And I appreciate you gentlemen coming to help out in this regard and educating us and our listeners. And joining us are Andy Sparks.
I'm Andy Sparks. I own the home brewery in Fayetteville, Arkansas. And I've been on a few of the podcasts with James, and I look forward to doing this test. I've wanted to do this for a long time, so I look forward to doing it.
And another regular here on the podcast is Steve Wilkes.
James, thanks for having me back again. I am a home brewer, fellow home brewer with James, and a loyal customer of Andy's. And and I'm really tickled to be part of this as well. This will be really interesting to do, so thanks.
And Chris Milum has been heard on the podcast. If you've listened to all the podcasts, he's in one of the early ones. And Chris, tell us what you do.
Well, I'm a CPA turned professional brewer. I'm the professional brewer down at the Hog House Brewing Company in Fayetteville, Arkansas.
And give us a bit about your educational background in brewing.
My educational background in brewing involves studying at the University of California, Davis, and also with the American Brewers Guild, which is in Middlebury, Vermont.
So you know a little bit more about beer than we do, I hope. And we're here to try out the FlavorActiv Enthusiast Beer Taste Troubleshooting Kit. And we've got to thank the American Homebrewers Association for helping us out and supplying us with the kit. And I'll put a link on our website on basicbrewingradio.com to the American Homebrewers website, or American Homebrewers Association website, so you can, if you're interested in the kit after you hear us go through it, you can know where to get one. And basically, it has 8 different off flavors that you can taste in a homebrewed beer. And these are represented in, there are 3 samples of each flavor that you mix in beer. And you're supposed to choose a beer that doesn't have much flavor. Is that right, Chris?
That's correct. Today, I think we chose the Coors Banquet. There's not much flavor in Coors, so it's a good beer in order to taste off flavors.
And, it is kind of you've got to hand it to Coors that we're confident enough in their brewing skills that we think there's not going to be any off flavors.
Correct. I mean, if you want a scientifically made, very high quality assurance beer, then Coors or any of your large breweries would be the same.
So we're looking for a subtle flavor in a beer.
Yes. That subtle post-war flavor.
So what we're going to do, the procedure with the test, and the reason you get 3 samples, is that you are supposed to mix the samples individually in 12 ounces of beer, taste them, read about the flavors, read about what you're tasting. The second round, you're supposed to do kind of a blind test to see if you remember what you've tasted. So you would mix in the flavor. The second time, blind, taste it, score yourself, or somebody would score you. And then the third round, you would mix the flavors in 24 ounces of beer, so that you would be diluting the flavor and really testing yourself. But tonight, what we're going to do is just go through one round, because obviously we're not going to have time on the podcast to go through all three. We may go through all three later.
Well, I sure hope so.
Andy's wanted to go through the test. He's been chomping at the bit. So Chris, you've done other more elaborate taste tests. Is that right?
Correct. Yes. Through my schooling, we've actually done a series of, I don't know, about 33 to 35 different flavor tastings, and just about every one of them is not too pleasant.
Oh, joy. I can't wait for this.
Hopefully this is the only time I taste some of these flavors.
Of course, Andy, being a homebrew shop owner, you told me one time that there's only one reason that people generally bring you beer, right?
Yeah, it's unfortunate that somebody walks through the front door with a couple of their homebrews. It's not because they're proud of it. It's because they want to know what they did wrong. So I get to try a lot of pretty bad beer, but everybody's got it in the right spot. They really want to make good beer, and that's why they're coming back to ask these questions. So I think this will be a big help for me to be able to tell people, what the different things and help diagnose their issues and their problems.
But have pity on your homebrew store owner. Bring him good beer every now and then.
Yeah, every now and then bring your prize beers. That's what we really want to drink.
Okay. Well, do you think that's enough to kind of introduce what we're doing here this evening?
I think so. Absolutely.
We've got our pitcher, and it's as we say back home, it's a crystal pitcher. We got it when we were married, and I've never used it, so now we're using it to mix bad beer. So we will mix our first sample of bad beer and or bad beer flavors, and we will be right back. Okay, now we've mixed the first sample. This is metal contamination in Coors.
Yeah. Ooh. Well, the nose of this is very metallic. That's amazing.
Well, I would describe it like if you put a penny in your mouth, kind of, wash it around a little bit, you'd have a good idea what this is like.
It's definitely coinage in your mouth. There's a slight blood, taste to it. Obviously, the taste, once you swallow the beer, or first you actually take the drink, let it set in your mouth a little bit, let it warm up, and then swallow and breathe out your nose. And what happens is those aromas that are pretty volatile go through to be scientific here, that epithelium, olfactory epithelium, which is the sensory in your nose that detects all these flavors, and you really get a sense of that metal contamination.
No kidding.
I've seen it more. Honestly, I've seen it more in home brewing than I have professional brewing, because we tend to have one way to avoid this is to use acid to clean all your stainless steel, because it passivates, replaces chromium, where you get a lot of rust, and it's a little harder to come by the good acid and well,
in not the 60s anymore.
Yeah, it depends on what part of the country you live in.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what this reminds me of. This is a flavor that I've experienced a number of times, and it reminds me of being about 19 years old and buying hot beer. Really, like, I don't want to say a label, but a cheap beer that's been sitting on somebody's counter, in the heat for a long time. That's its flavor to me. It's like, let's have a beer. Yeah.
Yeah, a long time ago, the cans were not lined or something, because I remember when I was young, old beers that had sat around for a long time would taste this way.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But I assume now with the lining on aluminum cans, you probably won't get that for quite a long time.
Absolutely. In fact, and of course I haven't tasted all that much homebrew from around places, but I've never tasted this taste in any homebrew that I've had. But I have tasted it in canned beer, and you're right, it's been many, many years ago. So, yeah.
It doesn't, when you guys were tasting it, I noticed especially, Steve, you really winced, like it really offended you. I don't know, maybe I wasn't just knocked over by this flavor. And maybe, Chris, do people's taste buds respond differently to different tastes? Or?
Oh, absolutely. To some, this might just taste like a penny, and to others, it's like somebody socked you in the mouth. It's definitely blood-like. Women have lower thresholds normally on several different flavors than men do. The younger you are, the lower your threshold is. The older you get, the less sensitive you are. So everybody's threshold is actually different. So it's no surprise that anyone in this group would say one tastes a lot worse than someone else.
Yeah. Now the card that comes with, there are cards that come with each flavor, and this is the one for metal contamination. It defines the problem, what you can do with the batch of beer, how you can prevent it from happening again, and other stuff is the category. This problem, if your beer tastes like this, it's been tainted by contact with poor quality metallic brewing equipment. Most commonly, such flavors are caused by ferrous ions from iron or steel. However, occasionally other metal ions or even non-metallic flavor substances are involved. What can you do with the batch? It may be possible to mask the flavor by adding some other strong flavor to the beer. Consider making a fruit beer from this batch by adding a commercial fruit essence. Or if the flavor intensity isn't too strong, try blending it with another beer that doesn't have the problem. And then obviously, how do you avoid preventing this from happening again? Avoid using poor quality equipment, especially equipment made from mild steel. Problems like this can also occasionally happen with equipment of sound quality when it's new. So we talked to John Palmer about using aluminum brew pots, and he said he advises, if you're going to use an aluminum brew pot, to boil water in it first to get kind of a film built up over the metal. Otherwise, the first time you use it, you might taste some metallic off flavors. So, and under other stuff, the flavor in this beer is ferrous ion, a tinny blood-like character. So it says, aside from having a distinctive flavor, ferrous ions affect the beer in other ways. They will make your beer foam more stable, which is a good thing.
Not if it's like this.
Man, that's a pretty beer. That's a pretty beer, but, it doesn't taste so good. But they will also speed up the development of haze and oxidation flavors. So there we go. Any other comments about metal contamination?
I'd like to say, though, for the listeners who are homebrewers, if you do have, obviously, a pot, or some of your valves that you might use are rusted, it's probably just best that you go ahead and replace them. But if you do want to go out and you want to buy the acid to actually passivate the stainless with, make sure it's a nitric acid blend. It's the nitric acid that does the passivation, not phosphoric.
And is that something that is nitric acid? Is it dangerous to use? You got to watch out for it?
Absolutely. You need to follow all the instructions, all the safety instructions that are included with it, all the personal protective equipment, and gloves, goggles. Naturally, it is an acid, and it can burn you.
Very good. All right. Well, we will rinse, and we will maybe eat a piece of bread.
Have a good beer.
And now, if we have a good beer between each of these, it's going to be a long evening. Okay, we will get set up, and we'll move to the next flavor. Okay, we're back, and I've instructed them not to smell their beers yet, because this next one is spoilage by acetic acid bacteria. Okay, everybody, pick up your glasses. And
I'm not really perceiving much aroma.
I'm not either. It actually smells a little sweet to me.
I'm actually I'm picking up some of the smells, almost like it's some of the wild beers, some of the sour beers in the nose a little bit. In fact, a lot. And I can't say that it's unpleasant, really. It's more. Is it more subtle than the first one?
It definitely seems to be to me. Maybe, I don't know. It seems a little sour, kind of I don't know, kind of a weird effect on my tongue, but I don't know really if I can describe what's different about it, nor what makes it special.
I think this, if you don't mind me saying so, is an opportunity where I think it would be beneficial for us all, because we all perceive this as pretty low in our terms of thresholds. Mm-hmm. Why don't we just taste a Coors, a regular Coors, and then taste that immediately, and then I think it'll jump out to all of us.
That's a good idea. We got to set a baseline.
Right now, it tastes like a bad Coors.
Yeah, Steve, do you want to? Mm-hmm. We'll use our water glasses.
Thirsty for some good beer?
Let's. We're going to dump our waters in the dump bucket, and Steve is going to. That's a good idea, Chris. We probably should have done that to begin with. Drink some of the Coors untainted to see what it tastes like, and then we can go back to the tainted stuff. Tainted stuff. I thought you poured out my water. Oh no! Wait, this is. I'm sorry. Cheap shot.
It's definitely much different, more different, or the difference is more perceivable now, but I still am having trouble describing it.
Yeah. The difference that I feel is in mouthfeel more, and I don't know if that's the powder or if that's, I don't know what's causing that, but it's kind of like the beer with the off flavor in it is flatter, and it tastes more watery. That the Coors, that's the good Coors, is crisper and brighter in my mouth, and this stuff just tastes like it's kind of old to me.
It seems a little I don't know, like a little more sour. Kind of tingles around the edge of my tongue or in the bottom of my mouth a little bit, like you do when you eat a sour candy. But I can't put my tongue or say what it is that I think it tastes like.
Shall we read the card?
Sure.
The card says the flavor in this beer is acetic acid, a vinegar-like flavor. Mm-hmm. So does that help you?
Yeah. But it doesn't taste like vinegar. I don't taste vinegar in this. It tastes a little sour, which some beers are meant to taste sour. So I guess you could always put this in the sour category. If this is the problem with your beer, you can just claim it's a crazy Belgian.
That's right.
It's a wild American ale.
Yeah.
Well, smell the beer and think of dyeing Easter eggs with those.
Oh yeah, that's great, James.
Yeah, it does.
That's
That
what it smells like.
It's a vinegary smell too.
Yeah.
That I remember from being a kid.
Yeah, it's like dyeing Easter eggs with those things where you put the vinegar and you put the little tablets in there.
Yeah, and I'd also say that when you and Andy went out to the brew event in Denver, and we then got some La Folie, as how you pronounce it, and that had that very strong sour taste and very strong. I called it sauerkraut in the nose. Mm-hmm. This has that, but the La Folie was really good, and this is just kind of flat and not really happening. So when you do it on purpose and you do it skillfully, that's when you have something that's worth putting in a champagne bottle.
It says the problem on the card. If your beer tastes like this, it's been spoiled by acetic acid bacteria. These could either be Acetobacter species or Gluconobacter species. Did I pronounce that right, Chris?
Close enough.
What can I do with a batch? Destroy it.
Yeah.
Whoa. There's little you can do to improve its flavor, and while you have it around, you risk spreading the problem to your other beers. Yes. However, if you're feeling adventurous, you could always make vinegar from it. And then how do I prevent this from happening again? There are two main contributors to this problem: dirty equipment and exposure of beer to air. The first is relatively easy to deal with. Sterilize all your equipment before use, either with chemicals or with heat. The second can be addressed by maintaining a blanket of CO2 on the beer at all times during and after fermentation. Avoid splashing of beer during transfers from one vessel to another. Finally, make sure the headspace on bottled beer isn't too big. So It says sometimes under other stuff also. It says sometimes beers which have been spoiled by acetic acid bacteria turn hazy or cloudy. This is partly due to the presence of many tiny bacterial cells and partly due to the precipitation of protein in the beer as a result of reduction in beer pH value. So, Chris, thoughts?
Sounds true to me. I haven't made a beer that tastes like this yet. So.
I think it was interesting how the change in pH of the beer gave you a mouthfeel effect. You know, there was not more malt or less malt, but you had this definite different feeling about it, which is kind of weird. Maybe you wouldn't think that would be there, but it definitely feels different in your mouth.
Very interesting. Yeah, and as the samples warm up, the flavor is more pronounced.
Yeah. Accurate perception there, James. When you're saying that, I thought, well, it's time to test it again, and I swirled it around and looked at the head clinging to the side of the glass and stuck my nose in the glass and smelled and made a really bad face. The bitter beer face.
The sour beer face. Or the acetic acid face.
I think the regular Coors never tasted better.
All right. Well, I think I'm not going to finish that one.
No, I'm done.
I think we're going to rinse these out, and but again, it wasn't. I was expecting to be knocked over by these samples,
By vinegar.
by the iron and the vinegar, but maybe they've done a good job of being subtle with these off flavors. So that it's not just pounding you in the face. You really have to look for it, and you really have to, because, I mean, when you get off flavors, they're not going to always be right up there up front, right, Chris?
Sure. I mean, this is really close to reality. I mean, when are you really going to drink a beer that just flat out tastes like blood, or the Farius ion, or really tastes like vinegar, unless you've let it set forever and it's turned into vinegar. Really, an off flavor in your beer is going to be something that's really low on the flavor thresholds, and and like I said before, so everybody tastes it a little bit differently, and so it might be pleasant to some people to have a small amount of what others would consider an off flavor, and then to others, it's just absolutely repulsive. But I think this kid has done a very good job of introducing the flavor at a nice threshold level. Still, like before with the Farius, it was very strong. That one was pretty high. I don't think we would make a beer that would be that high. So it would take some dilution, but it definitely introduces you to the flavor and shows you how to look behind the typical flavors in your beer, and in order to to identify these flavors.
Now, I'll give you a homebrew of mine that I call Rusty Bucket later on.
I think they need to include the suggestion about the side beer in the instructions, because clearly it's pretty much the only way to do this is to be able to taste one against the other, especially when you're getting a little more of a less powerful sample. Because this one just didn't taste near as strong as the last one.
Of course, we looked at the instructions that had the pictures and followed that, but the step one on the actual written instructions that I just dug out from the kit, it says, become familiar with the aroma and taste of the regular beer. If all else fails, read the instructions. Yes. So, okay. Well, now maybe we'll go over the instructions again before we go to the next sample, but yeah. Okay, well, we will pause again and go on to the next. Welcome to round 3. And shall I say what this is before we taste it? Shall I say what it is? This is bacterial growth in the mash.
Ooh, maybe we don't want to do this one.
Oh, you've signed on, Andy. You're in for the long haul.
Do you have sufficient insurance in case there's a problem, James? Later on.
Well. Okay. I've had about enough of that. Boy, I've smelled that in the back of my car.
It reminds me of a day here at the Hog House when I started it. I got there early. I wanted to get the day over with. I was brewing that day. I thought, I'll go in early, so I got there at 6. Started brewing. Everything's going great. got my mash, and I was bringing it up to temperature. And my kettle went out on me. The burner just completely quit. We had a problem with our pilot light. Just went out. So the repair guy, the repairman, couldn't arrive until late that afternoon. He got there, couldn't repair it. So it's like, well, you know, what the heck? I'm gonna let it set overnight, see what it smells like in the morning, just for fun. I wanted to, you know, see what the soured mash really smelled like, because I never attempted it before. And that's exactly what it smelled like the next day when I came in.
So, needless to say, you were shoveling it out of the kettle.
Yes, needless to say, it all went down the drain.
Oh, as that warms up, it smells more and more.
That is one of the worst things I have ever tasted in my life. and I've eaten Army food. So,
Well, actually, you know, most home brewers may have had a chance to experience the smell, whether you used like specialty grains or if you're an all-grain brewer, you've dumped your mash out somewhere like a compost pile and gone back a week or two later, and it smells really ripe if you kick it over. And this is what this smells like, just rotting grain, kind of.
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely, we give all of our malt away after we use it, all the spent grain. And there's not much left in it, a little bit of vitamin, that's about it. We give it to the cows, and that's definitely, those grain buckets that we shovel all our grain into, that's a good smell.
Boy. Well, the aroma hits me more than the flavor. And it reminds me, I was on my way, I was on an airplane, and there was a kid behind me, in the seat, you know, behind me, and it was a business trip, and on the way in, or all the way, the kid was happy and jumping and, you know, playing around, and I noticed that the kid became very quiet on the landing approach, and then I started smelling this coming up from behind me, and under other stuff, on the bacterial growth in the mash, we have, the flavors in this beer are butyric acid, is that right?
That is correct.
A flavor reminiscent of baby vomit. Thank you. Thank you very much. And our old friend acetic acid, the vinegar-like character.
No, it does taste a little bit sour, so I don't know. It's pretty unpleasant.
I mean, I've dealt with baby vomit, but I've never tasted it, so I'll have to take their word on that. But
again, this is something that, you know, it would be in your mash, and again, the mash is obviously aerobic. It's always exposed to oxygen, and so you have a ton of bacteria that could actually go into just leaving your mash sitting around. If you plated it, you know, as we would say in the industry, if you plate it and you take a look at it, then it's, you know, too numerous to count because there's way too much bacteria. Just, you know, in the grain itself, it's been sitting in silos. It's never been sanitized or anything. So there's a wide range of bacteria that would show up if you were to leave your mash sitting around.
And you would have to leave it for quite a while to get this level of contamination, wouldn't you?
Actually, there's some really great Belgian beers out there that are made through a process of sour mashing. You know, it's been a process that was around before they knew better, obviously. But, you know, they do develop some pretty good soured mashed beers, and there's a few microbreweries in the U.S. that do it. And they'll let it set, you know, somewhere between, you know, 5 hours or a little bit more. They might go overnight. But it's pretty much a minimum of 5 hours, and then you can start to really taste that soured mash finish into the beer. What happens is the bacteria obviously is no longer alive. After you boil it, you know, it dies and excretes all of its contents. But the effect of that bacteria, those chemicals that it's released, is still in the beer, and it's going to stay in the beer.
So if you're mashing and you get called away, you get called into work, and you come back to it a few hours later, you might just want to get some more grain, right?
Change the style that you're aiming for. You just never forget. You're just homebrewing. It's very plausible just to change the style
and go for the baby vomit.
Yeah.
Now it says under problem. It says if your beer tastes like this, pardon me, I've got baby vomit. If your beer tastes like this, your mash has suffered bacterial spoilage. The bacteria involved most likely belong to one of two groups: Bacillus or Clostridium. Is that right?
I don't know the Clostridium. I'd have to read it.
That sounds like something you'd get an ointment for.
Yes.
What can I do with the batch? These off flavors are not very flavor active, so you may be able to blend this beer with another beer that is free of off flavors to produce something that is quite acceptable. Try blending one part of your problem beer with 3 parts of another and see if you can still taste the off flavors. So maybe there's some salvaging involved in there.
And I wanted to ask, it strikes me that these off flavors could be at different levels. In other words, you might have, a 20% bacterial infection problem or an 80% bacterial infection problem. So in some ways there might be a scale thing. And, if the off flavor isn't just knocking you over, maybe it's okay.
Right. There actually is a flavor wheel that's involved. It's, I should point out now that what we're doing here is more of what we would call organoleptic testers. We're just a bunch of guys who like beer that are sitting around drinking the beer. Now, the scientific part would be done by a sensory analyst. A sensory analyst has received tons of training, receives retraining all the time, and they can, name off the bat 100 different flavors, and they're able to identify them blindly. We can now identify baby sick.
I got that down.
But there is a difference, and the flavor wheel is based on flavor thresholds, and they're just the average threshold level at which you would notice certain contaminations. And in any beer, there's maybe 100 different flavors. You're not expected, obviously, to even notice all of them. Maybe you'll just notice a few. There are your forefront, the primary flavors, and then there's secondary and even tertiary flavors that come into play. And for instance, like astringency. It's astringency is unwanted in a lot of beers, but it might be pleasant in some beers to have that actual effect on your tongue that makes you want to drink a little bit more. It would be obviously a tertiary flavor, and not obviously you don't want to, this is very astringent, it's my primary flavor in this beer. But absolutely, a lot of these compounds are desirable, not so much baby sick, but a lot of them are desirable in some beers. And obviously, if you're making that style of beer, it's not an off flavor. It's the flavor you're going for, or that threshold is what you're going for. If it's not, if you're trying to make the American lager and you end up with the soured mash flavor in your beer, obviously something went wrong, and it is considered an off flavor.
Very good. Well, I can't wait. Pardon me. Well, I can't wait to get some water. So I think we'll do that. We will get some water and maybe a little bit of good beer, and cleanse our palates a little bit, and we'll go on to the next round. Okay, this is round 4. Everybody's warming up their samples a little bit. And this is spoilage by wild yeasts. And Steve's making a face again already.
Yeah, I don't know.
Well, if this gets worse, when it gets warmer, it's going to start to get really bad, I'm afraid. It already
I'm afraid to taste it.
This is one of those that I would say it tastes like if you're adventurous and you're in the liquor store and you thought, well, I can't really pronounce the name of that beer in the 22-ounce cork bottle, but I'll go ahead and buy it. And you end up with some random Belgian beer in your shelf.
Are you not a Belgian fan, Chris?
Oh, no, I am. I'm a Belgian fan because you never know exactly what's in there. But it has a nice. I mean, there's a terrible flavor in there, but there's behind it. There's this nice. It's not quite floral, but it's definitely fruity. It's a little perky, a little sharp fruit in there.
Oh, but the aftertaste is what gets me.
Yes. Yeah.
It just kind of lays down and takes residence right there.
Yeah. I think Groucho Marx had a line in one of his movies that he felt like it was W.C. Fields. He felt like the Russian army had been walking over his tongue in their stocking feet. This is pretty much
what you're left with.
Yeah.
Okay, spoilage by wild yeasts. The flavors in this beer are 4-vinyl. Help me, Chris, guaiacol,
Yeah.
a clove-like character,
Okay.
and styrene, a plastic-like flavor. So if you were drinking your coffee cup instead of drinking out of your coffee cup. If your beer tastes like this, it has been spoiled by wild yeast that belong to the genus Saccharomyces or to the genus Brettanomyces. And Andy, you sell these in your store, don't you?
Well, yeah, because these are the basic yeast that you can get from White Labs and Y yeast that are the Belgian strains. But there are only two of the whole bunch of different kinds of yeast that make up the Belgian beers and make them so unique. But they are the two predominant ones, and they're the ones they sell.
It says, what can I do with a batch? You may be able to blend this beer with another beer that is free of off flavors to produce something that is quite acceptable. Try blending one part of your problem beer with 3 parts of another and see if you can still taste the off flavor. Alternately, you could think about making an opportunity out of the problem. You've produced something that's halfway to being a Weiss beer, or is it a Weiss beer?
No, it's either way.
So why not go the whole way, brew a Weiss beer and blend it with this one to make something special?
I think, like I'd mentioned earlier, it has that pleasant note behind it, and that's exactly what I was thinking of, is that clove flavor that I've tasted in plenty of, German wheats or Trappist ales. It has that nice little clove note to it.
It says, basically, clean your stuff. And it says, deal with contaminated yeast by replacing it with a fresh supply from a reputable source. Don't try to acid wash it. Acid washing doesn't kill wild yeast. So that's a good point. It will kill bacteria,
Sure.
right? But it won't kill the wild yeast because it's a yeast too.
Right, and if you are so brave and you're a home brewer and you're going to try to acid wash your yeast, be careful, because don't expect to be able to make the same beer you made when it was a normal yeast when you bought it from the manufacturer, because the acid is actually going to change the yeast profile, and it's actually going to have a different profile the next time you use it. So as a professional, they always say if you acid wash your yeast, acid wash it every time. If you don't acid wash your yeast, don't do it.
Because there goes your consistency.
Exactly.
Keep the beer covered during fermentation, and avoid putting the fermenter in damp, moldy areas.
Oh,
So,
well, I have that problem.
so this isn't the. I went crazy over the wild beers. Over the stuff from like Russian River and I think Pizza Port was doing some stuff.
Port had some, and who was it? Goose Island had a couple too. But then it's a balance, and you have a rich malty character, something to balance this against. Where we're drinking against such a light profile, the cores, that it's really way out of character. It's just it's unpleasant because it's so up front.
So don't let us turn you off of trying to brew with Brett.
I encourage people to brew with Brett. You should be adventurous. And I think on the podcast that you did with Vinny, they talked about the fact that they do things in different balances, so they might add only a very little bit of this yeast, and they do it in like the secondary fermentation, so that it doesn't have as much sugar to work with, so you don't pick up as much of the flavor. Because it is what you want is a subtle touch of this, not overpowering. Unless that's, I guess, what you're going for.
Yeah, they're adventurous, I think, is a good word for it, because there are some adventurous brewers out there who have used 100% Brett to make their beer. Again, that's what they were going for, so I wouldn't necessarily call it an off flavor in their beer, but it's definitely, in course, as we're drinking it tonight, it is a strong off flavor, and I think it's a good point that this is probably 5 or 6 times the threshold of what you would normally find in a regular beer.
And also, they were talking about the dangers of working with wild yeasts. Andy and I went to a presentation where Vinny Chilurso from Russian River and the brewer from Allagash and Goose Island were up there talking about Belgian beers. They started talking about working with Brett And in their breweries, they basically have set up a separate brewing system just to deal with the wild yeast.
Oh, sure, yeah. It's if you have more than one strain of yeast in your brewing system, in your brew house or in your cellar, as you call it, where all your fermenters are, it's a pain. You always want to try to dedicate the same tank to the same yeast strain because you don't want to leave, a few yeast cells behind. They start to multiply in your beer. You're repitching it. Then, if I have an ale and I'm making a lager in my brewery and I switch tanks, then all of a sudden you don't notice it in my first beer that I have a lager yeast in my ale or vice versa. But 5 or 6 generations down the road, I'm going to have a wild yeast in my ale because I have my lager yeast contaminating my ale. And in that sense, it's a wild yeast as any yeast that you don't want in your beer. I think it is hard. You never want to switch your tanks if you can. Always use the same line of tanks for the same types of beer, most certainly.
And in homebrewing, would you want to dedicate a certain carboy or a certain fermentation bucket if you use the buckets for Brett, or can you get it out of your stuff?
Well, let's say if you're really adventurous and you want to go out and you want to use some sort of wooden cask or a Jack Daniel's cask or something to make your beer in, and you put bread in it, don't expect to ever get the bread out. It's going to be in there. But if you're using a glass carboy, glass is easy to clean. It's non-porous. You can pretty much clean that really easily. No threat there. Again, the threat comes from repitching your yeast. If you don't repitch, then you're probably never really going to have a problem with this, with the wild yeast in it. But if you're repitching and you're letting that yeast grow, then one's going to take over the other, and you'll definitely start to taste it. In that case, go buy some more yeast.
So this is maybe one of the, if you're trying to either save money or just to experiment and to wash your yeast, as I've been trying to do, and you start to pick up some funkiness, there's no going back. Right. Go to the homebrew store. Go see Andy.
Support your local homebrew store.
It's really not that expensive. Lots of us buy a new one every batch.
Well, great. Well, that's. I think we'll call. We'll this good for the first round, and we'll pick this up at a later podcast. We'll do the second round of tasting tonight, but we may skip a week and come back with another podcast on this subject. With gentlemen, I appreciate your time and your sacrifice. Steve is speechless.
I'm totally speechless, and I was just trying to think of a pleasant way to thank you for the bad beer.
And thanks again to the American Homebrewers Association and Cindy especially for helping us out with and supplying us with this kit. And we are tasting some nasty stuff, but the good thing is that hopefully if we do taste this nasty stuff in our beer in the future and we want to know what we did wrong, hopefully we'll remember back.
Well, I can tell you the first several batches I brewed, I would just freak out. I'd taste the first one and go, what's wrong with this? Almost always it was fine. I just didn't know what it was supposed to taste like yet. And in fact, I'm one of the guys that brought in some beer to you. Like my second or third batch, the first one was fine. The first batch I ever made was a porter. It was great. But like the second batch I brought in, or that I tasted, well, it turned out I just tasted it way too early. It wasn't done at all. But I was freaking out. And so you helped me figure that out. And it turned out that the beer was great later on.
I had a boil over my first batch, and all the hops wound up on the stove. And I took my beer into Andy, saying, oh, my first beer, and Andy looked at his partner at the time and said, they both tasted it. And Andy looked at his partner and he said, he knows what he did wrong. Oh, well, thanks, guys, and we will pick this up later.
I want to thank Andy Sparks, Chris Milum, and Steve Wilkes for their help and for being so brave to face such flavors. You can find a link to the home brewery and the Hog House Brewing Company on basicbrewingradio.com. You can also find a link to the page of the American Homebrewers Association site that features the FlavorActiv kit. And thanks once again, much thanks once again to the American Homebrewers Association for their help. Well, next week I'm planning on having David Myers from Redstone Meadery to talk about mead in general and the International Mead Festival specifically.
That's coming up on February 10th and 11th in Boulder, Colorado. For information on the festival, you can go to meadfest.com. And if you have brewing questions, show suggestions, or just want to say hey, write to james@basicbrewing.com or just fill out the contact form on basicbrewing.com. And please don't forget to tell us where you're from. And if you're wanting to get into home brewing, while you're on our site, you can check out our DVD, Basic Brewing, Introduction to Extract Home Brewing. We'll walk you through the process step by step. And you can see a listing of the fine folks across the country who sell our DVD. And if there isn't a vendor in your area, you can order it from us directly online. And don't forget about our all-grain DVD at basicbrewing.com/grain. Well, that's all until next week. Until then, thanks for listening. I'm James Spencer. Production help for Basic Brewing Radio and our website is provided by Kelly Dodson. Basic Brewing Radio is a production of Active Voicing. We'll talk to you next time. So long.